So, chapter 12, Monsignor Bienvenu's Isolation. A bishop is nearly always surrounded by a troop of minor clerics, like a bunch of young officers around a general. They are what the delightful St. Francis of Sales calls somewhere beardless boy priests. Every profession has its aspiring apprentices who form the retinue of those who have already risen. No power is without its entourage, no fortune without its courtiers. Those seeking a future flurry around present splendor. Every archbishop has his general staff. Every bishop of the slightest influence has about him his patrol squad of cherubim seminarists. Seminarists? Sounds better. Seminarists that do their rounds of the episcopal palace, maintaining order and mount guard around Monsignor's smile. To please a bishop is to get your foot on the ladder for a subdeaconry. A man must make his way. An apostle is not above a sinecure. Just as elsewhere there are bigwigs, in the church there are big mitres. These are the bishops who enjoy royal favor, who are astute, wealthy, with a good income and a place in society, who doubtless know how to pray, but also how to crave favors. None too scrupulous about turning the whole diocese, represented in their person, into a hanger-on, point of contact between the sacristy and the church's higher echelons. They are more holders of church livings than priests, more ecclesiastical dignitaries than bishops. Happy those who come within their orbit. Being persons of influence, they shower on those around them, on the zealous and the favored, and on all that youthful willingness to please rich parishes, prebends, archdeaconries, chaplaincies, and cathedral appointments in the expectation of episcopal honors. As they advance themselves, they cause their satellites to progress also. It is an entire solar system on the move. Their radiance spreads its purple glow over their suite. Their prosperity is dispersed in nice little preferments to those in its orbit. The larger the patron's diocese, the richer his favorites' living. And then there is Rome, a bishop who manages to become an archbishop who manages to become a cardinal, takes you along with him as a conclavist. You are admitted to the rota, you receive the pallium, and then you are an auditor, then a chamberlain, then a monsignor, and from your grace to your eminence is only one step, and between your eminence and your holiness there is but the smoke of a ballot. Every skullcap may dream of the papal crown. And what a king! The supreme king! So what a hotbed of aspirations is a seminary! How many blushing choristers, how many young priests, like Perrette with her pot of milk, build castles in the air! How quick ambition is to call itself vocation, in good faith, perhaps, deceiving itself in its sanctimonious complacency, who can tell? Humble, poor, untypical, Monsignor Bienvenu was not one of the big mitres. This was obvious from the complete absence of young priests about him. We have seen that he did not get on in Paris. Not one clerical future dreamed of grafting itself onto this solitary old man. Not a single sprouting ambition was so foolish as to grow in his shade. His canons and vicars general were good-hearted old men, of rather humble origin, like him cut off in these dioceses that led to no cardinalship, with this difference in their resemblance to their bishop. They were finished. He was fulfilled. So well did they sense the impossibility of prospering with Monsignor Bienvenu that no sooner Had the young men ordained by him left the seminary, that they would obtain a recommendation to the Archbishop of Awe or of Ach, and be off very quickly. For after all, we say it again, a man wants to be brought on. A saint who lives an excessively self-denying life makes a dangerous neighbor. He might pass on to you through infectiousness, an incurable poverty, a stiffening of those joints useful for self-advancement, and in short, more self-denial than you want. And people flee this contagious virtue. Hence the isolation of Monseigneur Bienvenu. We live in a dismal society. Succeed, that is the lesson dripping down from the corruption at the top. Let it be said in passing, success is a fairly hideous thing. Its false resemblance to merit deceives men. For the masses, success has almost the same profile as supremacy. Success, talent's seeming double, has a dupe, history. Juvenal and Tacitus alone decry it. In our day, a more or less official philosophy has joined its household staff, wears the livery of success, and runs its antechamber. Principle of success, prosperity implies capability. Win the lottery, and you are a clever man. Whoever wins is respected. Be born lucky, that is all. If luck is yours, the rest will follow. Be fortunate, and you will be thought great. Leaving aside 5 or 6 outstanding exceptions who are the glory of their age, contemporary admiration is mere short-sightedness. Gilding is gold. Being a non-entity is no obstacle, as long as you make a name for yourself. The undistinguished is an old Narcissus who adores himself and celebrates the undistinguished. The great genius that makes a man a Moses, an Aeschylus, a Dante, a Michelangelo, or a Napoleon, the multitude is quick to recognize by acclamation in any Tom, Dick, or Harry who achieves whatever his goal might be. Let a notary transform himself into a deputy. Let a spurious Corneille write Tiridat. Let a eunuch manage to acquire a harem. Let a military Prudhomme accidentally win the decisive battle of an era. Let an apothecary invent cardboard souls for the Somme-et-Meaux army, and out of this cardboard, sold as leather, build up for himself an income of 400,000 francs. Let a peddler espouse usury and beget 7 or 8 millions, of which he is the father and usury the mother. Let a preacher become bishop by virtue of droning on. Let the steward of a good family be so rich on retiring from service that he is made minister of finance. Men call this genius, just as they call Mousqueton's face beauty and Claudius's bull neck majesty. They mistake for the constellations in the infinite of space the star-shaped footprints left by ducks in the soft wetland mud. Harsh, but awesome. Chapter 13, What He Believed. We need not go into the Bishop of Dinay's orthodoxy in terms of church doctrine. In the presence of such a soul, we are inclined to feel nothing but respect. The good man's conscience must be taken at his word. In any case, we recognize that, given a certain disposition, all the glories of human virtue may develop in a person with beliefs different from our own. What did he think of this dogma, or that mystery? These are secrets of the inner self. These secrets of the inner self One more time. These secrets of the inner self are known only to the grave, where souls go bared. What we are sure of is that for him, the difficulties of faith were never resolved by hypocrisy. There is no possibility of corruption in a diamond. He believed as much as he could. Credo in patrem. I believe in the Father, he often exclaimed, and he drew from good works all the satisfaction that conscience needs, a satisfaction that whispers to you, you're with God. What we do feel bound to point out is that outside, as it were, and beyond his faith, the bishop possessed a surfeit of love. It was because of this, quia multum amavit, an allusion to Luke 7:47, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much, that he was criticized by serious-minded men, responsible individuals, and reasonable people, favorite expressions in our sad world where egotism takes its cue from pedantry. What was this surfeit of love? It was a serene benevolence, flowing over mankind, as we have already mentioned, and on occasion extending even to things. He lived without scorn. He was kind to God's creation. Turning the page is very hard. Every man, even the best of men, has within him a thoughtless callousness reserved for animals. The Bishop of Digne did not have this callousness, typical, in fact, of many priests. He did not go as far as the Brahmin, but he seemed to have meditated on this text from Ecclesiastes, "Who knows where the spirit of the beast goes?" Physical unsightliness, aberrations of instinct did not disturb him and did not affect him. He was moved almost to pity by them. He seemed thoughtfully to seek the cause, explanation, or excuse for them beyond the visible world. At times it seemed as if he were asking God to go easier on them. He examined, without anger, and with the eye of a linguist deciphering a I'm not saying French, what is that word? Palimpsest. And with the eye of a linguist deciphering a palimpsest, the great chaos that still exists in nature. This study sometimes elicited strange words from him. He was in his garden one morning. He thought he was alone, but his sister was walking behind him, and he did not see her. All of a sudden he paused and gazed at something on the ground. It was a horrible large, black, hairy spider. His sister heard him say, "Poor creature, it's not to blame." Why not relate these childish expressions of almost divine goodness? Infantile, if you will, but these sublime infantilisms were those of St. Francis of Assisi and Marcus Aurelius. One day, he sprained his ankle trying not to step on an ant. That's amazing. Such was the life of this good man. Sometimes he fell asleep in his garden, and then he was as venerable as could be. If the stories told about him in his youth and even in his maturity were to be believed, Monsignor Bienvenu had in the past been a passionate, perhaps violent man. His universal kindness was not so much a natural instinct as the result of a strong conviction that had penetrated his heart through the filter of life, a conviction slowly instilled in him, thought by thought. For as drops of water may wear holes in a rock, so it is with character. These grooves are indelible. These formations are indestructible. In 1815, as we have already said, he was close on 75, but looked no more than 60. He was not tall. He was a little overweight, and to combat this he gladly went on long walks. He was sure-footed and only very slightly stooped. Not that we presume to draw any conclusion from this detail. Gregory XVI, at the age of 80, was upright and smiling, which did not prevent him from being a bad bishop. Monsignor Bienvenu was what in common parlance is called a good-looking man, but his face was so kindly, people forgot about his good looks. When he chatted with that childish gaiety that was one of his charms, and of which we have already spoken, people felt at ease in his company. His entire being seemed to exude joy. His fresh, ruddy complexion, the full set of fine white teeth he still had, which showed when he smiled, gave him that open and easy-going manner which, in a grown man, prompts the remark, "He's a good lad," and in an old man, "He's a good fellow." This, it will be recalled, was the effect he produced on Napoleon. To begin with, and to anyone seeing him for the first time, he was not much more than that, a good fellow. But if you were to remain for a few hours in his company, and ever saw him pensive, the good fellow was gradually transfigured, becoming somehow imposing. His broad, earnest forehead, to which his white hair lent nobility, was ennobled also by reflection. Majesty emanated from this goodness, while the goodness radiated without ceasing. You experienced something of the emotion you might feel if you saw a smiling angel slowly unfold its wings without ceasing to smile. Respect, an ineffable respect, gradually overcame you and made your heart swell, and you felt that you had before you one of those strong, proven, forgiving souls whose magnanimity is so great it cannot be other than gentle. As we have seen, every day of his life was filled with prayer, celebrating religious rites, almsgiving, consoling the afflicted, cultivating a patch of land, fraternity, frugality, hospitality, self-denial, trust, study, work. And filled is the appropriate word. The bishop's day was indeed quite full to the brim of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Nevertheless, it was not complete if cold or rainy weather prevented him from spending an hour or two in his garden before going to bed at night, after the two women had retired. It seemed to be a kind of ritual for him to prepare for sleep with some contemplative thought in the presence of the spectacular wonders of the nocturnal sky. Sometimes, even quite late at night, if the two elderly women were not asleep, they would hear him strolling along the garden paths. There he was, by himself, meditative, peaceful, worshipful, comparing the serenity of his heart with the serenity of the heavens, stirred in the darkness by the visible splendor of the constellations and the invisible splendor of God, opening his soul to thoughts descending from the unknown. At such moments, offering up his heart, when nocturnal flowers offered up their perfume, like a lighted lamp in the middle of the starry night, shining in ecstasy amid the universal radiance of creation, he himself probably could not have said what was happening in his spirit. He felt something soar out of him, and something descend upon him. Mysterious exchanges between the chasms of the soul and the chasms of the universe. He thought of the greatness and presence of God, of the strange mystery of eternity to come, and, stranger still, the mystery of past eternity, of all the infinities reaching out before his eyes in every direction, and without seeking to comprehend the incomprehensible, he gazed on it. He did not study God, he yielded to the radiance of God. He considered these magnificent conjunctions of atoms that lend appearance to matter, reveal forces by putting them into effect, create individuality within unity, proportion within the continuum of space, the numberless within the infinite, and produce beauty through light. There is a continuous binding and loosening of these conjunctions, hence life and death. He would sit on a wooden bench with his back against a ramshackle trellis and gaze at the stars through the silhouetted shapes of his puny and stunted fruit trees. He cherished this quarter of an acre, so poorly planted, so cluttered with sheds and tumble-down outhouses, and was content with it. What further need had this old man who divided the little free time there was in his life between gardening during the day and contemplation at night? Was not this small enclosure, with the heavens for a ceiling, enough for him to be able to worship God in his most delightful works and his most sublime works, each in turn? Was not all here, in fact? What more could anyone wish for? A little garden in which to stroll and boundless space for dreaming. At his feet, what a man may grow and pick, and above his head, what he may study and meditate on. A few flowers in the ground, and all the stars in the firmament. I'm going to take a sip of water. Do I have any fun stories for you? Oh, I beat The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So obviously no spoilers, but I'm really grateful because, I didn't play it as much during vacation, but I kind of made sure to stop in on it because that's the kind of game that if you take a week away from it, and you're like, oh, I'll get back. I'll remember what I was doing. And then a week becomes 2 weeks, becomes a month, and then you try to get back into it, and you can't. You got to start over. So I'm happy that I kind of plowed through a little bit. And as well, just it's a great game, and you can play it for hundreds of hours, I would assume, to really pick up everything. But I wanted to get to the end. Yeah, you know the feeling. So I'm happy that I finished it. Now I won't feel as compelled at night to be like, I have to keep playing Zelda. Now I can, clean my house. Very excited for that. It's a good game. Definitely play it. Yeah, Final Fantasy also comes to mind as far as games where I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'll come back to this, and then never get back to it. Same thing with when I tried to play Persona 5. Oh boy. Chapter 14. What he thought. One last word. Since details of this kind might give the Bishop of Diné, particularly at the present time, a somewhat pantheistic cast, to use a currently fashionable term, and lead to the belief, whether to his credit or discredit, that he entertained one of those personal philosophies peculiar to our century, that sometimes germinate in solitary spirits, developing and growing until they replace religion. Pardon me. This we insist on. Not one of those who knew Monseigneur Bienvenu would have considered themselves entitled to think anything of the sort. What illuminated this man was the heart. His wisdom was constituted of the light that comes from there. No abstract theories, many practical deeds. Abstruse's speculations have something dizzying about them. Nothing suggests that he ventured into apocalyptic speculations. The apostle may be bold, but the bishop must be timid. He would probably have had qualms about exploring too deeply certain problems reserved, as it were, for great revolutionary minds. There is an inviolable horror at the portals of the enigma. Those dark openings stand there gaping, but something tells you, one of life's passers-by, not to enter. Woe to whoever goes in there. Geniuses, in the uncharted depths of abstraction and pure speculation, placed so to speak above all doctrines, propose their ideas to God. Their prayer daringly invites discussion. Their adoration is questioning. This is direct religion, full of anxiety and responsibility for whoever attempts its challenges. Human thought knows no boundary. At its peril, it analyzes and explores its own bedazzlement. One might say that in a splendid reaction of sorts, it thereby dazzles nature. The mysterious world that surrounds us returns what it receives. The contemplators are probably contemplated. However that may be, there are on earth men, are they men, who perceive distinctly, on dreaming's far horizons, the heights of the absolute, and behold the awesome sight of the infinite mountain. Monsignor Bienvenu was not one of these men. Monsignor Bienvenu was no genius. He would have feared those sublime peaks from which some, even the very great among them, such as Swedenborg and Pascal, have slipped into insanity. Certainly these powerful conceits have their moral usefulness, and by these arduous paths one may approach ideal perfection. But he took the shorter path, the gospel. He did not attempt to impart to his chasuble the folds of Elijah's mantle. He cast no future light on the mysterious uncertainty of events. He did not seek to condense the luster of things into a burning flame. There was nothing of the prophet and nothing of the mage about him. This humble soul loved. That's all. It is probable he invested in prayer a superhuman level of aspiration, but it is no more possible to pray too much than it is to love too much. And if it were a heresy to pray beyond the texts, St. Teresa and St. Jerome would be heretics. Texts. It's hard to say. He felt for whatever suffers and expiates. The universe seemed to him an immense sickness. He was aware of fever everywhere. Everywhere he heard the sound of suffering, and without seeking to understand the mystery, he strove to dress the wound. The fearful spectacle of created things fostered compassion in him. His sole concern was to find for himself and to inspire in others the best way to pity and comfort. What exists was, for this good and exceptional priest, a permanent cause of a sorrow seeking to console. There are men who toil to extract gold. He toiled to extract pity. Universal wretchedness was his mine. Suffering everywhere was but an opportunity for kindness, always. Love one another, he declared. He declared this to be wholly sufficient, wished for nothing more, and herein lay his entire doctrine. One day the man who considered himself a philosopher, that senator mentioned above, said to the bishop, "Just look at the spectacle the world presents. Everyone at war with everyone else, the mightiest is the most canny. Your love one another is an absurdity." "Well," replied Monsignor Bienvenu without arguing, "if it is an absurdity, the soul ought to wrap itself up inside it like the pearl in the oyster." So did he wrap himself up in it, and lived his life there, absolutely content to do so, leaving aside the stupendous questions that lure and appall, the limitless perspectives of abstraction, the precipices of metaphysics, all those profundities converging for the apostle in God, for the atheist in nothingness, destiny, good and evil, the warring of human beings against each other, man's consciousness, the pensive somnambulism of animals, transformation by death, the compendium of existences contained in the tomb, the incomprehensible grafting of successive loves on the enduring self, essence, substance, being and non-being, the soul, nature, freedom, necessity. Unscalable problems, dangerous obscurities on which the gigantic archangels of the human mind turn their attention, dreadful abysses that Lucretius, Manu, St. Paul, and Dante contemplate with that blazing eye, gazing intently on the infinite, and there seeming to bring stars into being. Monsignor Bienvenu was simply a man who noted the mysterious questions from the outside, but without studying them, without debating them, and without troubling his own mind over them, and who had in his soul a respect, a serious respect for the unknown. We finished Book 1. It's now Book 2, The Fall. Cool. And we're like 57 pages into 1,300 pages. Alright, so it took us a week. 2 weeks for 100 pages, so it's just going to take us 26 weeks. That's all. Half of a year. I was going to give it like a month. I'm in trouble. Book 2, The Fall. Chapter 1, The Evening After a Day's Walking. Early in the month of October, 1815, about an hour before sunset, a man, traveling on foot, entered the little town of Diné. The few inhabitants who were at their windows, or at the doors of their houses at the time, viewed this wayfarer with a kind of unease. It would be hard to come across a more wretched-looking passer-by. He was a man of average height, stocky and robust, in the prime of life. He might have been 46 or 48 years old. A cap with its leather peak pulled down partly concealed his weather-beaten face, streaming with sweat. His shirt of coarse yellow cloth, fastened at the neck with a small silver anchor, revealed a glimpse of his hairy chest. He wore a rolled-up neckerchief, threadbare blue drill trousers, with one knee faded to white and a hole in the other, a ragged old gray overall patched on one elbow with a bit of green cloth sewn on with twine, a soldier's knapsack on his back that was stuffed full, firmly buckled and brand new, a huge knotted stick in his hand, hobnailed shoes on his stockingless feet, a shaven head, and a long beard. The sweat, the heat, the journey on foot, the dust added an indefinite disreputability to this shabby outfit. An indefinable disreputability to this shabby outfit. His head was shaven, yet bristling, for his hair had begun to grow a little and looked as if it had not been cut for some time. No one knew him. He was obviously just someone passing through. Where did he come from? The south. The coast, perhaps. For he came into Diné by the same route that 7 months earlier had witnessed the passage of the Emperor Napoleon on his way from Cannes to Paris. This man must have been walking all day. He looked very tired. Some women down in the old part of town had seen him stop under the trees on Boulevard Gassendi and drink at the fountain that stands at the end of the parade. He must have been very thirsty, for the children who followed him saw him stop again 200 paces further on to drink at the fountain in the marketplace. When he came to the corner of Rue Pochevert, he turned left and made for the town hall. He went inside, then emerged a quarter of an hour later. A gendarme was seated near the doorway and on the stone bench that General Drouot had climbed onto on the 4th of March to read out to the dismayed crowd of Diné's inhabitants the Gulf of Juan proclamation. The man pulled off his cap and bowed humbly to the gendarme. Without responding to his bow, the gendarme watched him closely, following him with his gaze for a while, then entered the town hall. In those days there was at Diné a fine inn called the Croix de Colba. The landlord of this inn was a certain Jacquin Labarre? Jaquin? Could be Jacquin Labarre, but I kind of want to say Jaquin because I pronounced his name Jakes when we did As You Like It, instead of Jacques, what have you. Jacquin Labarre, a man respected in the town for being related to another Labarre, who was innkeeper of the Trois Dauphins at Grenoble, and had served in the Guides Corps, At the time of the emperor's landing, there were many rumors circulating locally about this Troy Dauphin inn. The story was that General Bertrand, disguised as a carter, had made frequent trips there during the month of January, distributing Legion of Honor crosses to soldiers and fistfuls of gold Napoleons to respectable citizens. The fact is that when the emperor entered Grenoble, he refused to be put up in the prefectural residence. He thanked the mayor, saying, "I'm going to stay with a good man I know," and he had gone to the Troy Dauphin. The glory of this Le Bar of the Troy Dauphin was reflected on to the Le Bar of the Croix de Colba, 100 miles away. People in the town said of him, "He's the cousin of the one at Grenoble." The man made his way towards the inn, which was the best there was in that part of the world. He entered the kitchen, which gave directly onto the street. All the ovens were lit. A huge fire blazed cheerfully in the fireplace. The host, who was also the cook, was very busy, toing and froing between the hearth and his saucepans, overseeing an excellent dinner intended for some carters who would be heard laughing and talking loudly in an adjoining room. Anyone who has ever traveled knows that none enjoy better fare than carters. A fat marmot, flanked by white partridges and black grouse, was turning on a long spit in front of the fire. Cooking on the range were 2 large carp from Lake Lazare and a trout from Lake Allo. Again, I'm just making up this French. I have no idea. Hearing the door open and a newcomer enter, the host said, without looking up from his cooking range, "What would monsieur be wanting?" "Food and lodging," said the man. "Nothing easier," replied the host. At that moment he looked round, took in the traveler's appearance with a single glance, and added, "If it's paid for." The man drew a large leather purse from the pocket of his overall and replied, "I have money." "In that case, we're at your service," said the host. The man put his purse back in his pocket, removed his knapsack, and sat on the ground by the door, kept his stick in his hand, and went and sat on a low stool close to the fire. Diné is in the mountains. October evenings are cold there. Meanwhile, the host went back and forth, observing the traveler. "Will dinner be ready soon?" said the man. "Shortly," replied the landlord. While the newcomer was warming himself with his back turned, the worthy host, Jaquin Lebert, drew a pencil from his pocket, then tore off the corner of an old newspaper left lying on a small table by the window. In the blank margin he wrote a line or two, folded it without sealing it, and handed this scrap of paper to a youngster who apparently served him as both kitchen help and errand boy. The landlord whispered a word in the kitchen lad's ear, and the youngster went running off in the direction of the town hall. The traveler had seen nothing of all this. Once again he inquired, "Will dinner be ready soon?" "Shortly," said the host. The child returned. He brought back the piece of paper. The host unfolded it eagerly, like someone expecting a reply. He appeared to read with close attention, then nodded, and remained thoughtful for a moment. Eventually he took a step towards the traveler, who looked deep in somewhat troubled thought. "Monsieur," he said, "I can't give you a room." The man half rose from his seat. "What? Are you afraid I won't pay? Do you want me to pay in advance? I have money, I tell you." "It's not that." "What then?" "You have money." "Yes," said the man. "But I," said the host, "have no room." The man answered calmly, "Put me in the stable." "I can't." "Why not?" "The horses take up all the space." "Very well," replied the man. "A corner in the loft, then, A bale of hay. We'll see about it after dinner. I can't serve you dinner. This declaration, made in a measured but firm tone, sounded serious to the stranger. He stood up. But I'm starving. I've been on the road since sunrise. I've walked 30 miles. I can pay. I want to eat. I have nothing, said the landlord. The man burst out laughing and turned towards the fireplace and the cooking range. Nothing? And what's all that? I've already taken orders for all that. From whom? The Carters. How many are they? 12. There's enough food there for 20. They've ordered the whole lot and paid for it in advance. The man sat down again and said without raising his voice, I'm here at the inn. I'm hungry and I'm staying. Then the host bent down to his ear and said in a tone that made him start, Be on your way. The traveler was leaning forward at that moment and poking some brands in the fire with the iron tip of his staff. He whipped round, and as he opened his mouth to reply, the host gazed steadily at him and added, still in a low voice, Look, enough of this talk. Do you want me to tell you what your name is? Your name's Jean Valjean. Now, do you want me to tell you who you are? When I saw you come in, I suspected something. I sent a message to the town hall, and this was the reply I received. Can you read? So saying, he held out to the stranger the piece of paper, now unfolded, that had just made the journey from the inn to the town hall, and from the town hall back to the inn. The man glanced at it. After a pause, the landlord went on, I make a habit of being polite to everyone. Be on your way. As a note, it says, the landlord's politeness resides in continuing to address Jean Valjean using the vous form of the verb. Neat. The man bowed his head, picked up the knapsack he had set on the ground, and went away. He followed the main street. He walked on aimlessly, keeping close to the houses, like a man humiliated and dejected. Not once did he turn round. Had he done so, he would have seen the innkeeper of the Croix de Corbes standing on his threshold, surrounded by all the travelers at his inn and all the passers-by in the street, talking animatedly and pointing at him, and he could have told from the group's expressions of suspicion and fear that before long his arrival would be the talk of the whole town. He saw nothing of all this. The oppressed do not look behind them. They know only too well the ill fate that dogs them. He kept walking like this for some time, on and on, following at random streets unknown to him, forgetting his weariness, as is the way with those who are despondent. Suddenly he felt extremely hungry. Darkness was falling. He looked about him to see if he could not find some shelter. The Grand Hotel had closed its doors to him. He sought some very humble tavern, some very lowly doss-house. As it happened, there was a light shining at the end of the street. A pine branch hanging from an iron bracket was outlined against the pale twilight sky. He made his way there. It was indeed a tavern, the tavern in Rue de Chaffaut. Chaffaut, actually, I suppose. The traveler paused for a moment and looked through the window into the tavern's low-ceilinged room, lit by a small lamp on a table, and then my cat stabbed me in the kneecap. Lit by a small lamp on a table and by a big fire in the hearth. A few men were drinking around it. The landlord was warming himself at it. Above, the flames simmered an iron pot suspended from a hook. There are 2 doors to this tavern, which is also an inn of sorts. One opens onto the street, the other onto a small yard filled with manure. The traveler dared not enter by the street door. He slipped into the yard, paused again, then raised the latch timidly and pushed open the door. "Who goes there?" said the master. "Someone who'd like supper and a bed." "You've come to the right place. There's supper and a bed here." He entered. All the people drinking turned round. The lamp lit him from one side, the fire from the other. They studied him for a while as he took off his knapsack. The host said to him, "There's a fire here. Supper's cooking in the pot. Come and warm yourself, comrade." He went and sat close to the hearth. He stretched out his feet, aching with tiredness, in front of the fire. An appetizing smell came from the pot. All that could be seen of his face under his pulled-down cap took on a vague air of well-being, mingled with that other very poignant expression imparted by the habit of suffering. Moreover, this was a strong, determined, sad face, with a strange cast of countenance. It started off looking humble, and ended up seeming hard. His eyes gleamed beneath his eyebrows like fire in the undergrowth. However, one of the men sitting at a table was a fishmonger who, before coming into the tavern in Rue de Chaffaut, had been to stable his horse at Le Ber's. As chance would have it, he had that very morning encountered this sinister-looking stranger on the road between it looks like Brass Das, Brada, and I have forgotten the name. I think it was Escoblon. Now, as he passed by, the man, who already looked very tired, had asked the fishmonger to let him ride behind him on his horse, to which the fishmonger's only reply had been to quicken his pace. This fishmonger had half an hour earlier been among the group in the company of Jacquin Lebert, and had himself related to the people at the Croix de Colba his unpleasant encounter of that morning. From where he sat, he signaled discreetly to the tavern keeper. The tavern keeper went over to him. They exchanged a few quiet words. Once again the man had become deeply absorbed. The tavern keeper returned to the fireplace, clapped his hand on the man's shoulder, and said to him, "You're going to make yourself scarce." The tavern keeper here uses the tu form of the verb in addressing Jean Valjean. Tu vas ten alardici. There was a poignancy in Jean Valjean's discontinuing to address the tavern keeper as vous. Ah, vous savez. The stranger turned round and replied quietly, "Ah, you know." "Yes. I was turned away from the other inn. And you're being thrown out of this one. Where do you expect me to go?" "Somewhere else?" The man took his stick and his knapsack and left. As he came out, some children who had followed him from the Croix de Colba, and who seemed to be waiting for him, threw stones at him. He turned round angrily and threatened them with his stick. The children scattered like a flock of birds. He passed in front of the prison. At the door there was an iron chain hanging down, attached to a bell. He rang the bell. A grille opened. "Turnkey," he said, respectfully removing his cap. "Would you kindly let me in and give me a lodging for the night?" A voice replied, "A prison's not a hotel. Get yourself arrested, then you'll be let in." The grille closed again. He came into a little street where there are many gardens. Some have only hedges around them, which makes the street more attractive. Among these gardens and hedges, he saw a small single-story house with a light in the window. He looked through the window as he had at the tavern. Inside was a large whitewashed room that had a bed with a chintz bedspread over it and a cradle in one corner. a few wooden chairs, and a double-barreled gun hanging on the wall. A table was laid in the center of the room. A copper lamp shed light on the coarse white linen tablecloth, the pewter jug gleaming like silver and filled with wine, and the steaming brown soup tureen. At this table sat a man of about 40, with an open and cheerful face. Never seen that word before. Dandling a small child on his knees. Close by, a very young woman was nursing another child. The father was laughing. The child was laughing. The mother was smiling. The stranger stood musing for a moment before this heartwarming and comforting scene. What was going on inside of him? Only he could have said. It is likely that he thought this happy home would be hospitable, and that in a place where he saw so much well-being, he would find, perhaps, a little pity. He gave a faint little tap on the window pane. No one heard. He knocked again. He heard the woman say, "Husband, I think someone's knocking." "No," replied the husband. He knocked a third time. The husband rose, took the lamp, went to the door and opened it. He was a tall man, half peasant farmer, half artisan. He wore a huge leather apron that came right up to his left shoulder, and bulging round his middle with a hammer, a red handkerchief, a powder horn, all kinds of objects tucked into the belt used as a pocket. He tilted his head back, with his shirt spread wide open, baring his white bull neck. He had thick eyebrows, enormous black whiskers, prominent eyes, a muzzle-like jaw, and overlying all this, that air of being a man in his own home, which is something no words can convey. "Forgive me, monsieur," said the traveler. "In exchange for payment, could you give me a plate of soup and a corner where I could sleep in that shed there in the garden? Could you, monsieur, in exchange for payment?" "Who are you?" asked the master of the house. The man replied, "I've come from Puymorsen. I've been walking all day. I've done 36 miles. Could you, for payment?" "I wouldn't refuse lodging to any respectable person who would pay me," said the peasant. "But why don't you go to an inn?" "There's no room." "Impossible. There's no fair today, and it's not market day. Have you been to Le Berre?" "Yes." "Well?" The traveler replied with confusion. "I don't know. He had no room for me." "Have you been to, what's his name, in Rue de Chaffaut?" The stranger's confusion increased. He stammered, "He had no room for me either." The peasant's face took on an expression of suspicion. He looked the newcomer up and down, and abruptly exclaimed, with a kind of shudder, "Would you be the man?" "Thanks, buddy." I was reading, but I have to take a break now to pet this cat who's giving me a hug. Hey, buddy. Oh, good kitty. Just straight up headbutting me in the mouth, like not even being subtle about it. Great job. You know, if we get enough followers, I'll stop. Cat on the lap. If we get enough followers, I want to be able to make it a thing where, like, when the cat shows up, you can donate pennies, and you get a pet per penny. But we have like 22 followers right now. We got to get at least 50. So, hit that follow button. Anyway, would you be the man? He took another look at the stranger, stepped back 3 paces, placed the lamp on the table, and took down his gun from the wall. Meanwhile, at the words the peasant had spoken, "Would you be the man?" the woman had risen, picked up both children in her arms and rushed to take refuge behind her husband, staring at the stranger in terror, her bosom uncovered and with fear in her eyes, murmuring quietly, Somarad. In the footnote, dialect of the French Alps meaning stray cat. Oh, it's about you. Good job. Ooh, just saw the note. Thank you for the plug. That'd be great. All this happened in less time than it takes to imagine it. Having stared at the man for a few moments the way you stare at a viper, the master of the house came to the door again and said, Clear off! For pity's sake, a glass of water, said the man. Over my dead body, said the peasant. Then he slammed the door, and the man heard him slide 2 large bolts. A moment later, the window shutter closed, and the sound of an iron bar being inserted was audible from outside. It was getting darker. The cold alpine wind was blowing. In the fading daylight, the stranger noticed in one of the gardens that lined the street a kind of hut that seemed to be made of clods of turf. He walked resolutely through a wooden gate and found himself in the garden. He went over to the hut. It had a very low, narrow opening for a doorway, and it looked like those sheds that road laborers build for themselves by the side of the road. No doubt he thought it was actually a road mender's hut. He was suffering from cold and hunger. Hunger he was resigned to, but this at least was shelter from the cold. This sort of shed is not usually occupied at night. He threw himself flat on his stomach and crept into the hut. It was warm inside, and he found a reasonably good bed of straw. He lay for a moment and stretched out on this bed, incapable of any movement, so exhausted was he. Then, as the knapsack on his back felt uncomfortable, and as it would do for a pillow, he started unbuckling one of the straps. At that moment, he heard a ferocious growl. He looked up. The head of an enormous mastiff loomed out of the darkness in the entrance to the hut. It was a dog's kennel. He was himself strong and fearsome. He armed himself with his stick, used his knapsack for a shield, and exited from the kennel as best he could, not without worsening the tears in his ragged clothes. He also exited from the garden, but backwards, obliged to keep the dog at bay by resorting to that maneuver with his stick that masters of this type of fencing call the covered rose. When he had got through the gate, not without difficulty, and found himself in the street again, alone, homeless, with no roof over his head, no shelter, driven out even from that bed of straw and that miserable kennel, he collapsed on a stone rather than sat on it, and apparently a passer-by heard him cry out, I'm not even a dog! Soon he stood up and started walking again. He left the town, hoping to find some tree or haystack in the fields where he could take shelter. So, for a while, he trudged on, the whole time with his head bowed. When he felt that he was far from all human habitation, he looked up and gazed around him. He was in a field. Before him was one of those low hills covered with close-cropped stubble that after the harvest looked like shaved heads. The horizon was pitch black. It was not only the darkness of night, but very low cloud that seemed to rest on the hill itself, and mounting to fill the whole sky. However, as the moon was about to rise, and there still remained a lingering glow of twilight overhead, these clouds formed a kind of pale vault high into the sky that cast a luminous reflection onto the earth. So the earth was lighter than the sky, which is a peculiarly sinister effect, and the hill, squat and dwarfish in shape, appeared indistinct and pallid against the gloomy horizon. The whole effect was ugly, small, dismal, and closed in. Nothing in the field or on the hill but a misshapen tree, rustling in its writhings a few steps away from the traveler. This man was obviously very far from having those discerning... I'm tired. We're almost done. Here we go. This man was obviously very far from having those discerning habits of mind and soul that make a person sensitive to the mysterious aspects of things. Nevertheless, there was something in that sky, that hill, that plain, and that tree, something so profoundly desolate that after standing there motionless for a moment, lost in thought, he suddenly turned round and walked back. There are moments when nature seems hostile. He retraced his steps. The gates of Diné were closed. Diné, which had withstood sieges during the wars of religion, was still surrounded in 1815 by ancient walls flanked by square towers that have since been demolished. He slipped through a gap and re-entered the town. Yeah, like one more burp in me. There we go. It might have been 8 o'clock in the evening. Since the streets were unfamiliar to him, he resumed his aimless wandering. This brought him to the prefecture, then to the seminary. As he walked past the cathedral, crossing the square in front of it, he shook his fist at it. At the corner of this square is a printing works. Here were first printed the proclamations to the army issued by the emperor and the imperial guard, which were brought from the island of Elba and dictated by Napoleon himself. Utterly worn out, and his hopes exhausted, he lay down on the stone bench that stands at the door of this printing house. At that moment, an old lady came out of the church. She saw the man lying in the dark. "What are you doing there, my friend?" she said. He answered harshly and angrily, "As you can see, good lady, I'm going to sleep here." The good lady in question, who fully deserved to be called so, was Madame la Marquise de R. Just big letter R. Okay. I wonder if this is actually Marquis, because there's an E at the end. I don't know. "On this bench?" she said. "I've had a wooden mattress for 19 years, said the man. "Now I have a stone mattress." "You were a soldier?" "Yes, good lady, a soldier." "Why don't you go to an inn?" "Because I have no money." "Unfortunately," said Madame de R., "I have only 4 sous in my purse." "Give them to me anyway." The man took the 4 sous. Madame de R. continued, "You can't pay for lodgings at an inn with so little. But have you actually tried? You can't possibly spend the night here. You must be cold and hungry. Someone might give you a bed out of charity." "I've knocked at every door." "Well?" "I've been turned away everywhere." The good lady touched the man's arm and pointed out to him on the far side of the square a small, low-roofed house that stood beside the episcopal palace. "You've knocked at every door?" she said. "Yes." "Have you knocked at that one?" "No." "Knock there." And that's where we'll stop. Hey, we finished book 1 of part 1. And hey, we met Jean Valjean. That's pretty awesome. Where's the actual, like... Yeah, geez. Alright, so there's... Oh, okay, these... Hey, I appreciate you. Thank you for coming. The the way the table of contents, I'll kind of pull up here. Each one of those separations isn't a chapter, it's a book in each part. Like The Fall is, 50 pages and it's going to be made up of several chapters. So 5 parts between 8, as many as 15 books. Oh yeah, this is fun. It's a strange sense of like reward and completion. 'Cause it's like you finished book 1, you're gonna get to finish book 2, and all that. I mean, it's huge. Like, I only know the musical, and everything in this whole first book is completely foreign to me, except for when they talk about the silver candles. I was like, hey, that's a plot point. Well, nonetheless, thank you so much for tuning in. And for everyone who watches this later on YouTube and whatnot, hey, we're looking for likes and follows on the Twitch channel, twitch.tv/HotDadReads. And of course, we have the Patreon at patreon.com/HotDadReads. So if you're trying to get access to the books we've already read, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, those are available there. And of course, things like the super secret Saturday Shakespeare stream, where you can catch up on the completion of Much Ado About Nothing. And we're 3 acts into Julius Caesar. We're going to finish that. This Saturday's pretty busy, but maybe this Saturday? I don't know. It's a secret. So anyway, thank you so much. And have yourselves an agreeable evening.